Oh, well, my name is Reggie Schreiber, and I went to art school back in the mid 90s and came out not really sure what I wanted to do. And a couple of teachers had told me that they thought maybe comics was a good direction for me and asked me if I had ever considered video game concept. And so I sent out a ton of portfolios back when you actually had to mail out portfolios and got some feedback from LucasArts and Capcom and a couple other places, and did some follow-up stuff with Capcom because I really liked their design room and the kind of art that they make, and spent like a year of my time after art school polishing up my 2D and 3D skills because I really didn't learn any 3D in school. Got my stuff together, made a 3D portfolio, sent it out, went back and forth with the art director at Capcom, and eventually they moved me out. So I moved out here in 2000 to the Bay Area from Ohio and spent 6 years at Capcom, then spent 6 months at EA, then spent 2 years at a THQ studio that was doing a bunch of Pixar stuff, and then ended up at Gaia, and then ended up at Playforge, which is where I'm at now. Well, I mean, the way I grew up, I had home consoles, but since I had so few games for them because I didn't have money, I would take my $1 a week allowance and go up to the mall and just hang out at the arcade, blow my dollar within 2 minutes because I sucked as a little kid trying to play arcade games, and then I'd just sit there the rest of the day watching other people play all the machines. So I was an annoying little hang-on kid who would sit there looking over the console, staring at the screens. So I loved watching that stuff, and as I got older and emulation became more common, I just loved revisiting old games. And then I actually got into collecting cabinets, and now I actually have a couple cabinets at home, and I collect some PC boards. So it's ingrained in me to love looking at scan lines and hearing the sounds and hearing the joystick and button noises, and to me it's music to my ears. So the fact that I could give back to that and give people kind of that experience too, that was what I was aiming for.
Like that, or
a lot of the old Capcom games I really loved were games that had shops in them. Like Black Tiger is a big influence on me, which was sort of a platformer action game where you would roam around levels, try to get to the bosses, and then you'd find shop guys along the way. And I really like that kind of building up your character as you go mentality to designing games. So that was one of the big things I wanted to drop into Slayin right away was, oh, this character has a little sword, but what if as the game gets harder you get to find shops that have more weapons that sort of beef you up so you can handle the harder and harder difficulty curve. And I think almost every game I've gone to develop since I worked on Slayin has some sort of nod to old Capcom arcade development like that. I mean, Forgotten Worlds has the same thing. There's shops all through that game that you can beef up your weapons with or beef up your armor. So the Knight is directly inspired by the Skipmore game that I worked on. So that was the starting point. That was the character that I had to figure out, how do I make this game more interesting based around this really simple concept of a character walking around with a hitbox strapped to their front. And once I had sort of taken that to its logical conclusion, I then wanted more characters in the mix, but I wanted to try, the typical archetypes. Like I want a mage, I want to try a thief, I want to try, an archer and all this other stuff. And as I would play around with those characters, I was thinking, well, I want it to be one button. I don't want to make this any more complex. How can I still make a character work with all the bosses, all the existing mechanics, but work with one button, work with right and left, directional controls? What can I do to make it so that that character can, cast spells, but it's not hard to understand? I didn't want to add too much complexity where someone was trying to tap other things on the screen or have to have another button in the mix. So I started looking at single button games. There's a lot of resurgence lately around the one press community, which is basically making games. Originally, those games were made more for the handicap set, people who only had one input, and they were really clever with how they created pretty standard games with just tapping the screen, whether you're holding your finger on the screen or you're not holding it on the screen. So I was looking at how they were doing mechanics in a lot of those kind of games, and then I realized after a lot of fumbling around how to make the wizard sort of work for casting spells, but also be able to, avoid projectiles, which I took away the wizard's jump because the button was no longer jump, the button was now cast a spell. So then I had to figure out, well, what kind of spell would make you, move through an object so that you don't get hit? And then, is that the only spell a wizard can cast? Like, how do I add more spells into the mix? And so it kind of built up from there. The Knave was my way of trying to make a knight that was more for a hardcore set, because the Knave is made to score higher. I think the biggest thing you need is motivation. Like, it's really easy nowadays to find authoring software, but I think a lot of people take on big projects really soon, and then they run out of steam really quick. So I think the one thing you need is to be motivated long enough to actually see a project through to end. But if you have enough passion for it, I think anyone can really learn how to make games.